Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and Columbia University professor, and he's pushing for a rethinking of the global economic framework in the wake of a financial crisis. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Now, you've written recently about the increase in disparity between rich and poor in the United States, and you've even compared these conditions to what led to the unrest we've seen in the Middle East. So what do you think are the factors that led to this, and what do you think the consequences will be?
Well, the point that I raised was the increase in the concentration of income and wealth in the United States has been enormous. What's happened in the last couple of decades is almost a quarter of all the income goes to the upper 1%. Around 40%, depending on how you measure it, of the wealth goes to the upper 1%. Americans used to think of themselves as a land of opportunity. Everybody else thinks of themselves as a land of opportunity, and they think of old Europe as ossified. The data don't show that.
Meanwhile, we see protests taking to the capitals of states like Wisconsin. So is this reaching a tipping point?
I think they're beginning to realize that most Americans are worse off than they were, say, a decade ago. So it's not just that all this wealth is going to the top. If everybody were getting better off, you could say, well, some are doing a little bit better than the others. But actually, most Americans are worse off than they were a decade ago. And that doesn't even include the sense of insecurity, the loss of jobs, the insecurity about health, rights that most people in Europe take for granted. In the United States, people, if they lose their job, can lose all access to health care. Now, one of the things that I raised in my article was that not only the political consequences, but the economic consequences, that there are many things that any society has to do together. You have to education, investments in technology, infrastructure, roads. That means there has to be a certain degree of consensus for a society to function, even economically. These are things the government has to do. But if you have a very split society, there are going to be very different views about what's important. If the rich can buy their own parks, they don't need to have public parks. If the rich can buy their own education, we don't have to have public education. If the rich can buy their own health care, we don't have to have good health care for most Americans. And that's where we're winding up today. So the people at the top, that 1%, are using their political power to try to preserve their wealth, and meanwhile making sure that the government doesn't do what is necessary for the prosperity, the functioning of our entire society.
We're not seeing an increase in funding for infrastructure or education or science. Instead, we're seeing quite the opposite. So do you think this country is headed in the wrong direction?
That's right. And that was what was brought home so forcefully by what was happening in Wisconsin. Here you have people saying all over the country, we need to improve education. But what are they doing? Cutting teacher salaries. Now, you're not going to attract the best people into education if you don't pay them. I mean, that's simple economics. And it's not a surprise in that context that today, in those standardized scores that rate education all over the world, the United States is really not doing very well.
So who's to blame here? Is it politicians asleep at the wheel who are out of touch with reality, or are there greater flaws in the system?
It's both. I mean, there are some really deep flaws in America's political system. Our campaign contributions, Supreme Court said that corporations are people. I mean, philosophically, I find that difficult, but they say because we can't restrain the rights of free speech, corporations have unlimited ability to contribute. And that means they can use their money to get laws that allow them to escape taxation and to shape a political process that really works for them, but not for the rest of the country. Now, what I argued in my paper, in my article, was this was short-sighted. If you don't make these investments, we're going to wind up in a divided society and an unproductive economy. And even that 1% will suffer. And that is the link between what happened in Tunisia and Mexico and in Egypt and other countries where the divide has grown, and it's meant that their economies haven't functioned and their societies have not functioned.
Speaking of not functioning well, what about the U.S. dollar? Because you're someone who's calling for a new global reserve currency, but why? Because some say, what's the alternative really?
Well, what I've argued for is a creation of a global reserve currency. Reserve currencies are, you might think of a store of value, and the dollar has been very unstable. Understandable given the difficulties, you might say, of American economy. Our performance was not stellar. But the fact that in a modern globalized economy, 21st century, it's an anachronism that a single currency would play the pivotal role that the dollar has played. What I argue, and I've argued in my book Making Globalization Work, is that the dollar reserve currency system contributes to inequality, that poor countries are lending to the United States at close to zero interest rate and then borrowing back at much higher interest rates, inequitable, it contributes to instability, and it actually contributes to a weakening of global aggregate demand, a weak global economy, because if countries are setting aside literally hundreds of billions of dollars, you might say, of precautionary savings, that's money not spent.
So you're saying essentially it hurts everybody to have the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency?
That's right. And what I've described in the UN Commission that I chair, the Commission on the Reform of the Global Financial Monetary System, explains how we can create a global reserve currency. And it's really interesting to be here at Bretton Woods talking about that, because Keynes argued for this 75 years ago. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, he understood how the links between UK's problem, the UK being the reserve currency then, and that if we're going to have global economic stability, we needed to move off of a single country being the reserve currency. Bretton Woods failed from his perspective in this respect.
And didn't the U.S. say, hey, we disagree, we want to be the main reserve currency, and got their way? So would the U.S. still have that same power if world leaders got together again today for another Bretton Woods conference? I
think at that same meeting we're held here in Bretton Woods, the world is markedly different. China has close to $3 trillion of reserves, about a third of the global reserves, about $9 trillion. When you're holding $3 trillion, you have some voice in what kind of reserve currency system you want to have. And China has been very clear that it worries about the current dollar-based reserve system. Right after our UN Commission came out in support, China supported it, France has supported it, Russia supported it. So there is a wide understanding, not unanimous, but a wide understanding of the importance of this idea. And I think if the global economy remains weak, I think there'll be more interest as one of the remedies to the current instability and weakness in the global economy.
China's also been critical of the United States for its policy of quantitative easing. And if I've read your writings correctly, you seem to be saying they have a point. So what is that point?
The point is that the U.S. is creating liquidity. U.S. worked very hard to open up global financial markets. And one of the implications of that is when you create liquidity, it can go anywhere in the world it wants. And where is it going? Not where we need it here in the United States. It's going where it's not needed, in China, Brazil, and other countries that don't want it. So it's not only they don't need it, they don't want it. We have to fix the banking system in the United States. Our system of getting money into small and medium-sized enterprises is clogged. And the Federal Reserve has not fixed it. They contributed to the creation of the crisis. They didn't understand the basic economics, and that's one of the purposes of the meeting here in Bretton Woods. But because they didn't understand the problems that they were creating, they didn't really understand how to fix it. And yes, they brought us back from the brink. They saved the big banks, but they have not really gotten our economy going again.
I want to thank you so much for this interview.